harmonized approach to UDI. Next slide.
Can you see it, Jackie?
It's, oh, there it is. Just kidding. So the one thing we know is everyone's watching. The whole world is watching UDI. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a global view of what's going on. Some of us have been involved in UDI since 2005. So we've been working at this for a really long time. And I can tell you we've progressed in some areas and we've still got a lot of work to do in others. So, but one thing is for sure, we're getting global attention to UDI now. Next slide. When we start talking about UDI, we always start with the IMDRF UDI system. IMDRF, if you go out to their website, you can see some of the documents that we've created. I was fortunate enough to be a part of that team, actually way back when we started as GHTF and moved into the IMDRF space. We completed a guidance document, and then just last year, industry proposed a new work item, and we were able to develop an application guide for the regulators. And then we have some informational documents that we also created. And all of that information is available on the IMDRF website if you'd like to see it. I have the link further in the presentation. So if we start with the fundamental concepts, these are the things you'll find in the IMDRF guidance. And these are just some of the basic fundamentals that we have to really abide by if we're going to implement a harmonized system. First of all, the UDI and its data carrier must be based on global standards. Secondly, UDI applied to a medical device anywhere in the world should be able to be used globally. It really shouldn't matter what country, what region is implementing. If we follow a global approach, we can all use the same identification schemes, so we're not having to re-identify devices every time we move to a new region. The guidance is very specific in saying that national or local identifiers should not be a substitute for UDI. Regulatory authorities should not specify the procedure for modifying those standards. This text comes right from the guidance document. The UDI database, we have set out a core set of data elements for the different regional UDI databases. The main concept is those core data elements should not be modified, not only in their content, but their definition. And what's really important, even how they're implemented. It's really important that we all agree on the same definition and implementation. We recognize that when we move to different regions, each region has its own regulatory requirements, and that there will be data elements that will need to be specific to each region, country. But what we're talking about here is just a very core set that should be common across regions. And lastly, every medical device needs to be identified by UDI unless it's exempted. And we have some exceptions in both the US and Europe today. But it's really important that all devices are identified in order for UDI to work. And just some more information on a globally harmonized approach to UDI. It's expected to provide, this is at a very high level, some of these benefits. Tania will talk about some of the other benefits, many more in more detail towards the end of the slide. First of all, traceability of medical devices, especially when we're in a situation where we have a field safety corrective action. It's really important to have adequate identification through, and this is the really important point, through the distribution supply chain and use. Use meaning use with the patient. So with UDI, we always say the supply chain doesn't end in distribution, it ends at the bedside with the patient. Identification of medical devices is critical for adverse event reporting. Reduction of medical errors. Do you have the right device at the right time, at the right place? And it also goes a long way in documenting and capturing of data on longitudinal studies. In clinical studies, for instance, if we can positively identify these devices when we're trying to do those analyses in studies, it really helps us out. It goes a long way. And I just wanted to mention Dennis Black from BD will be talking about IMDRF in more detail in Module 2. I'm just hitting it here at a high level. One more click, Tania, please. So this introduction is taken from the initial guidance we developed, published in 2013. And I've highlighted the important part of it is that this framework can be used at a local, national level in order to reach a globally harmonized system, but it's critical that these systems are implemented without regional or national differences. So here you can see the timeline. We established the work group under GHTF in 2018. We published the first guidance in 2013. And then just last year, we finished an application guide that gets into a lot of detail on how we should implement the concepts in the guidance. And then we've also put together a couple informational documents that we thought were helpful. One talks about system requirements for use in healthcare, and it gives you some use cases. And the other one is a mapping of the different data elements in different regions. That document needs to be updated. So there will be a new work item proposal proposed to IMDRF in March, and it's to update that second document. And again, if you want to see these documents, you can go out to the IMDRF website. Thank you. And here I've put together, again, just a very high level timeline of how long we've been working at UDI. And what this is it goes by country and the timeline. And those countries that initially published above the green IMDRF highlighted area, published, it wasn't called UDI, but the concepts that I'm highlighting here are the same, as you can see. And so I just wanted to show that many of these are using the same standard. Label requirements are aligned, and their data reporting historically was different. Historically, before UDI became UDI, the standards were used for reimbursement primarily. And then we have the US moving first, moving into Argentina, then Turkey. So that's the history, and looking to the future. Next slide is here. as you all know, we're working on that EU implementation now, and we have the rest following out. And then we have some countries that are pending release. We've just received the consultation from Australia, so we'll be looking forward to what Australia will be proposing for its implementation in the future. Next slide.
Yeah, so Jackie, maybe before we go to the next segment, I don't know if there are any questions that anyone might have. Okay, guess we can continue.
Okay.
I think we have one one question from Anju. Yes, Anju, please go ahead.
Yeah, if you move 2 slides back, where the India is showing, yeah, this one. So here it is saying the initial was 2014, but under the flag it is written 2012. So it started at 12 or 14?
I believe it was 14. I don't know why that says 12.
Yeah, 12 is written under the flag.
I know we've had a lot of stops. Yeah.
Just wondering.
I'm not. Yeah. Good catch. Thank you. I didn't catch that. But I know we've had a lot of stops and starts. I was involved in the initial publication through GS1. I actually helped write the implementation guide for GS1 India. And I'm thinking it was 2014, but I thank you. I will fix that, find out which is which.
Thank you.
I think Gaurav has raised his hand.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello, Jackie.
Yes, Gaurav, please carry on.
Can I continue for the question?
Yes.
Yeah, the question is, during the introduction, you also mentioned about tracking and tracing of devices through UDI. How practical and how applicable it is to include track and trace with UDI? Are these connected, or these two are different objectives?
They're connected as far as traceability, but when we get into track and trace, that's a very different thing. As you know, track and trace requires serialization of all devices, no matter what their classification. And that's a very difficult thing for medical device manufacturers. And we see track and trace in the pharmaceutical area, where there is a lot of counterfeiting and a lot of, counterfeiting and counterfeit drugs entering into the supply chain. So there is a real purpose on the pharma side. But when they do track and trace, they're not tracking every single little pill like we would have to for devices. So we always caution that traceability is one thing, track and trace is another. That requires real-time systems bumping up against each other constantly and literally tracking every single serialized device. And so we have one region, that's Argentina, that has implemented track and trace for medical devices on a very small scale. There are 8 device types only. They're all implantable, but they have not been able to extend it beyond that because it requires some massive systems throughout the supply chain. So did that answer your question? UDI is
thank you.
not
Pretty clear.
Okay.
We have another question from Lydia. Lydia, you can unmute yourself.
Yes. Hi, Jackie. Thank you for the informative presentation. Just a quick question, because you've presented in different countries and it's in my region. I wanted to understand, there was any type of harmonized approach for these countries like Turkey, India, together, or no, they have different approaches? And how was this done or implemented, and what is the scope for Saudi, which is coming through? Is it following the same, or it will be a different one?
Okay, so those countries implementing prior to the IMDRF guidance that became available in 2013, they were really they had done their implementation individually. And for instance, Japan, none of them are referred to exactly as UDI, but in Japan, they started their implementation. It's basically implementing the GS1 standards, and GS1 now being one of the primary issuing entities called out by regulators for the device identifier prefix, is really how a lot of them started on their implementations were based on GS1. Turkey they worked on their implementation, but they decided they wanted to allow HIBIC, another standards organization, in as well. But they worked independently. They were not coordinating with one another, but primarily the tie was through the GS1 global organization. And then after IMDRF, we see countries beginning to follow those core concepts of IMDRF. I can tell you Saudi Arabia specifically is well aligned with the US FDA implementation, which follows the IMDRF principles. In fact, the person from the US FDA subsequently left the FDA and is consulting and helped the Saudi Arabia officials with their implementation. So it's very, very well aligned with the US.
Thanks. We'll just take one last question before we move on. Prashant, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks. So just taking the cue from what Gaurav asked. So in case of for India, we need to propose to the authority saying that traceability is the one which you need to look at and not the track and trace, right? Because track and trace, as you said, is more complicated, which requires serialization of each device for monitoring and stuff. So we need to look at traceability rather than track and trace, right?
Correct. Very good point. Very good point. Yes, absolutely.
And across other countries, apart from Argentina, the rest of the other countries are looking at traceability and not track and trace for the time being.
For the time being, correct. Turkey has talked about it, but they haven't been able to get to an implementation.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, can we just take one last question? We have Ashok sir also, I think, raising his hand.
Thanks, Anirudh. Hi, Jackie. See, I mean, we were told that Russia has decided that, I mean, UDI is not going to serve their purpose, and therefore they have started a track and trace as a pilot for some assistive devices. So if that is the case, then there is, I mean, because there are certain economies where track and trace is gaining importance. I mean, where the regulators are more or less like pharmaceutical regulators, the requirement of is becoming a reality. So I don't know how we are going to have this thing addressed, because it will be difficult for the global manufacturers to have two different systems, and we can't have same products. I mean, we'll have to have a separate supply chain for these countries if we have a track and trace and other things.
Well, we do not have any countries or any regions today that are using UDI for track and trace. That we know.
No. What I was telling is that some like Russia has found out that UDI will not be able to help their system of tracking, and therefore they wanted to go for track and trace instead of UDI.
Okay. So the difference being track and trace. If you wanted to use UDI for track and trace, your production identifiers would all be serialized, and there would not allow any lot controlled product. You could still use the device identifier and the other identifiers, but everything has to be serialized, and UDI does not require serialization. So, and again, there is a business case, a very good business case for the pharmaceuticals, because counterfeit drugs are getting into the supply chain and people are being negatively affected. People are dying. It's really important. But I always ask the question for medical devices, do we have that same problem at that same magnitude with those same outcomes? So the question is the business case, because as we've just heard, it is very expensive. The systems have to be real-time systems, then they all have to be connected, and everything has to be serialized. I can imagine my friends from BD here who make syringes, billions of syringes, my friend Dennis Black tells me. And if their manufacturing lines had to slow down to the point of putting a serial number on each syringe, that would impact their manufacturing abilities. So there has to be a benefit analysis done, and to look at the impact of those requirements. And I think it would be a great idea if industry got together, can put that story together, that business case, to show the impact. And then the question becomes, what is the problem we're trying to solve, and are we solving?
Yeah, you are right. Actually, this part, I mean, at least for in India and Bangladesh, there are not many cases, especially the global brands are being counterfeited and supplied, and therefore the regulators have ample case to go for serialization. So that is where we are worried about.
Mm-hmm. It is a concern. Yes.
Thank you. So I think we can now move on to the next section.
Hey, Jackie.
Yep. I'm waiting for the slide to come up. I'm not seeing the next slide, Tania.
Yeah, so it's talking about, so the next part is going to be the usage of UDI and why do.
Okay.
I mean, yes, and that's
So,
showing.
oh, there it is.
Okay.
Okay. So this is a slide I put together many, many years ago just to talk about what's the need, what's driving the need. And I put this little scenario together. This is an example only, but it gives you an idea of the problem that we've had to deal with historically. And that is our systems of product identifiers, be it catalog numbers or ref numbers, whatever you want to call them, include duplicate identifiers for different products across different manufacturers. And I put this little table together to kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about. We have 3 manufacturers, Medtronic, BD, and J&J. We all have a catalog number historically. This is an old slide, so don't call me on if these are current. But we've all had catalog number 305905. And guess what? look at the different devices that represent that catalog number. For Medtronic, it's one of our heart valves. For BD, it's one of their syringes. For J&J, it's an IV catheter system. So if you can imagine receiving these identifiers being in the hospital or through a distributor, when they have these different products identified with the same catalog numbers. So what happens is when these products that all have these duplicate identifiers get to a distributor has to re-identify them with, sometimes maybe it's a prefix, some other method to distinguish between those three things that have identical identifiers. And then it gets to the hospital. And a lot of times, because there's so much duplication, the hospitals were assigning their own identifiers. So as you can see, as this product moves through the supply chain, when there's duplication, at every stop along the way, it makes it extremely difficult to try and track these devices. And then in the event of a recall, you have to try to unwind all of these identifiers that were re-identified and connect it back to the source. It just becomes very complicated. And my parting message is that UDI requires all healthcare stakeholders, the healthcare supply chain, to use the same device identifier, or this really doesn't work. And that is my last slide. And now we're going to move on to the basics of UDI and format.
Yeah,
and
so
I'll turn this over to Tania.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. So there are three distinct, ideas around, UDI and implementing it. And so the first is going to be developing a standardized system of unique device identifiers. I think we just saw that kind of being an issue in the last slide that Jackie saw when we keep changing it throughout the supply chain before UDI. The second concept is going to be placing the UDI in human readable and the AutoID formats on the package label and the device. And then the third is going to be registering the UDI data in a public database. So I think as Jackie mentioned before in the previous slide, so we started doing the US implementation back in 2014. So the database is the good ID. And for the EU, it's going to be UDIMED. And for China, it's going to be the UDID. So each region's coming up with their own name for their global database. So I'm going to start talking about the development of a standardized system of the UDI. So the first thing is you need is choosing an issuing agency to develop the UDI and assign the device identifier. So there are three issuing agencies that the FDA references and is currently issuing for product identifiers. So one being GS1. And then, of course, there's HBIC, and then there is ICBBA. And GS1 is the global standard, uses the global trade item number, which is the GTIN. So again, this is used across many different sectors, such as retail, transportation, fast moving consumer goods. And it is a good solution for large multinational companies who must comply with the mandates to use GS1 in other countries such as India, Spain, Turkey, and Japan. GS1 is truly a global standard with offices in 109 countries. HBIC uses the Universal Product Number, or UPN. So this was developed in the US specifically for healthcare. They have offices in the US, Australia, the Netherlands, France, and Turkey. This is usually a good solution for smaller manufacturers who does business primarily in the US, and so they don't have to worry about the mandates of other countries to use as GS1. And then there is ICCBBA, and so they're using the International Society of Blood Transfusions. So these are used for products of human origin. So this things anything that includes like blood, cells, tissue, and organ products. And again, this is currently the only standard that has the donor code that's necessary to be in the UDI for the human tissue cell products. And so there are two components of the UDI. There is the device identifier, and there is the production identifier. So the device identifier is a fixed portion that identifies a specific product number, of the device and the label of the device. And so for Medtronic, this is going to be the GS1 Global Trade Item Number, which is the GTIN. So it's going to be the first part of the UDI. The second part is going to be the production identifier. And again, this is going to be, a variable portion that identifies one or more of the below. So it includes the lot or batch number, the serial number, the expiration date, and the date that the device was manufactured. So this is an example of, kind of what a GS1 128 barcode looks like. So at the top, you can see that's going to be the barcode, and then the human readable is going to be at the bottom. You can see the part that's highlighted in red is going to be the device identifier, or the GTIN. And then the things that are highlighted in blue are going to be the production identifiers. And so again, not the use by date or lot number or serial number are always going to be there. It might be a combination of a couple of them. And I think, Jackie, this is what you were mentioning as far as from a traceability, that if we wanted to have that, then we would have to have a new serial number that would represent every single device if we wanted to track it in that manner. And that we couldn't and then of course that would not probably have, it loses the ability of being able to track by the lot and batch information. Okay, so what UDI is not, is there a comment? I'm sorry. Okay, so the device.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, no, there's just one message that I see. Is could we slides after the session?
Yes, I've made an update, so I'll send you the updated version of it. But yeah, we can make these available after the session.
Sure, thank you. So I'll send it out to all of you. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so what a UDI is not, is not a unique number representing a single individual device. So this is not serialization. So when a product is serialized, that's when a UDI represents a single device. An important concept is that, the catalog number or reference number may have many device identifiers associated. So you should not assume that it's going to be a one-to-one relationship where a catalog number or reference number is only going to have a device identifier. I know that this has been some challenges in hospitals where they have their systems set up where it's going to be one-to-one. And I will be speaking about this on the next slide. So there are going to be cases where there are going to be, multiple device identifiers that still represent the same catalog or reference number. As Jackie mentioned earlier, the device identifier is not country specific. It's intended to be a global identifier. This is the way that we can kind of, combine information from a global perspective and connect the dots. The device identifier does not contain a single mechanism to parse out intelligence. There are many different data structures of a DI, even though they all use the same standard. So again, if we follow the global harmonized approach of IMDRF and GS1, which is our issuing agency, a UDI is not new or different identifier than what has already been assigned in many products in the supply chain that provides efficiency and automation for many years. I think as Jackie mentioned, we've been, at least from a Medtronic perspective, we have been doing this for probably since the late 90s. So we have been, developing a standardized system of UDI for many, many years. But again, there are reasons as far as when you would need to create a new device identifier. You want to be able to distinguish if the product is not going to be interchangeable. And so that's when you want to create a new device identifier. At least within the US and the EU, regulation, they have stated, and these are some of the examples of if there's going to be a product change, that's when you would have to create a new GTIN to represent, going from version A to version B. So an example could be if there's going to be a quantity of devices, one of the device packages that were to change. So if you were to go from a 4-pack to a 2-pack, the GTIN that represents the 4-pack cannot be the same that represents the 2-pack. So you have to change the GTIN because you changed the quantity as far as what's going to be placed within the device package. Other examples could be, if you're going to change the brand name, if the sterilization indication, the package changes, if the latex warning changes, the MRI safety, the combination product, and these are just examples from an EU and a US perspective. As new regulations have come on board, I know there, and Jackie, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there should be some core changes, but what we have noticed is that and especially with the EU, there are a lot more triggers that will cause for you to have to create a new GTIN. This will, impact, this from a global perspective, because again, a GTIN or our device identifiers are not specific for a region. So if the EU, if we make a change to a product that we sell in the EU and we, requires us to change the identifier, we now still have to add that information for another region, because we're not going to just ship that change to the EU. Is probably still going to be a global product. So that's one thing to kind of, I think, keep an eye on is I'm not going to say minimize, but to make sure that we can be harmonized in how we're going to change our device identifiers from a global perspective. So before we move to UDI carriers, are there any questions? Okay. So next we're going to move to UDI carrier. So as I mentioned before, the second part was about placing the UDI and the human readable and the AutoID formats on the package on the label of device. So one thing to note is that no single AIDC method should be required by a regulatory authority. It's globally accepted, methods, and it's going to be based on the ISO standard, GS1, HIPIC, or ICC-BBA. That's what should be used. But these are example of some different formats. And so when you're trying to figure out which one to use, you want to figure out what's going to be best for your application. Is the warehouse going to be automated? What type of scanners do you have? How far the scanner is going to be whenever they have to read it? You also want to take into consideration the space that you actually have on the label. Do you have, for the long, GS1 128 barcode, do you have enough space to have that actually on your label? And another thing is to make sure that all the stakeholders within the supply chain will be able to read it, because if you can read it at the beginning but can't be at the end, that's going to cause an issue. So again, the GS1 2D data matrix, again, it's small. It can go on really small packaging labels if the space is going to be constrained. It does have can get a lot of information. You can see the human readable part is going to be on the right hand side of the barcode. But one thing is that these are slow to read in comparison to the GS128. The GS128, I think, are used in highly automated manufacturing sites, because they have a quick speed to read the fast lines on the GS1 in comparison to the 2D matrix. But one thing is that if you're beginning to start this, you want to, I think industry advice is that you want to invest in scanners that have both a camera or image based, because it opens up the ability of you being able to scan quickly the different type of formats. Our IFD is the one that is in the center. I think this is the one that might be not used as much, as not everyone within the supply chain has the equipment to be able to read this. And then, of course, we have the QR code. Again, it is not a GS1 healthcare approved for usage on packaging labeling. I think there are multiple symbologies, and you don't want to have multiple involved. But again, it's probably going to be something that is not within the GS1 healthcare. So as far as the rules for creating the barcode, for linear, it can be concatenated, or you can break it down into two or more barcodes and have them stacked. But again, the human readable format should still follow the rules of the UDI code, issue, and organization. And again, if there is significant space constraints on the unit of use, again, the UDI carrier can be placed at the next higher packaging level, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Again, the UDI carrier for single-use medical devices for risks class A and B that are packaged and are labeled individually, it does not need to be on its own package, but rather on the higher level of packaging, so maybe just on the carton. Another thing to note is that for non-prescription medical devices that are used for retail, they do not need to have the production identifiers in the AIDC. on the packaging. So you can see the representation that we have there. That's only going to give you the DI portion of the barcode.
Tania, we have a question with regard to barcode on packages.
Okay, I don't know how you're seeing that, Jackie. But
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I think we have a question from Ashwini from J&J. Ashwini, would you like to unmute yourself and clarify a little what you were asking here? No, not really. I think the question on your chat says, can we use all type in one product, linear, matrix, and RFID?
So far in the legislation we've seen, they leave the decision to the manufacturer. And this was in the slide, the last slide. The important point is we don't ever want to see a mandate for one versus another, because we have to let the manufacturers decide which one is best for their applications. I'll give you an example. For Medtronic, we have highly automated distribution centers that are owned by Medtronic, and they have conveyor belts that are going everywhere quickly. We use a linear barcode for that reason, because that's more amenable to those conveyor belt scanners that you want the product to go by quickly. If you have to scan a data matrix, you have to be up close to it, where the linear barcode, you can shoot that from a distance and you can still scan it. So it all depends on the manufacturer's application for how they're using these barcodes. And that's why it's really important that we emphasize that decision needs to stay with the manufacturer, and we don't want a mandate of one or the other. So all legislation that we've seen so far allows us to use whichever choice we want to use. And these are the three most popular. Does that answer the question? I hope.
Okay, yeah, I think he's facing some problems with the mic. So in the meanwhile, I think we have Shiv who is raising his hand. Shiv, please ask your question.
Yes, so Jackie, to clarify, I think what I heard was, I think the question was, you know, instead of choosing one, can you choose a combination? So can you do the GS1 128 as well as the data matrix? So that I guess you would kind of ensure that all your stakeholders could read it depending on what scanners that they have. I'm assuming that was what the question was.
Yeah, there's nothing in the legislation that will tell you you can't put more than one barcode, but the GS1 standards, their best practices are one barcode, one identifier, because it causes confusion if you have all sorts of different barcodes or RFID chips. And also the US FDA, they really have kind of harped on this, that they do not want to see more than one barcode. If you put more than one barcode on your package, they want you to put a tag in front of that barcode with a UDI symbol. There's a new ISO symbol that's coming out. It's UDI, it's the letters UDI with a box around it. You'll have to put that on your label in front of the UDI, so the end user knows which barcode to scan. Because the hospitals are complaining that they're getting too many products with too many barcodes and they don't know which one to scan.
All right, so can we take one last question before we move on? Shiv, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Anirudh. Quick question. Let's say there are devices which are non-sterile implant, which will be sterilized in hospital. And there are devices which are very small, which have been supplied in trays. So how to meet a UDI requirement for those devices? And is there an exclusion which can be brought in India as well?
Okay, good question. So we worked with FDA for years, literally years on this. You're probably talking about some of the orthopedic loaner sets, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we did finally get FDA to understand the issue, and now we're working on the European Commission to get them to understand the same issue, and I think we're making good progress. But so what they have asked us is they want us to develop a mechanism to capture the UDI at point of use. And what they've said is manufacturers, you can determine or come up with a methodology to do that. They'll even let you, in the US, they'll let you use what's referred to as a cross-reference method. If you can cross-reference that identifier that is on, say, your orthopedic screw, I know it's really tiny, but if you can cross-reference that with the UDI that belongs to that screw and make that available to the end user, that's acceptable in the US. Some manufacturers have developed solutions that are tags that clip on to the head of the screw. But what I've seen mostly is manufacturers are developing web portals where they're doing the cross-reference. They use the identifier that's on the device and make this cross-reference available through a web portal. I know of a couple manufacturers that were doing it manually with paper about 4 years ago. I don't know if they're still doing that. Doesn't seem to be, I mean, I don't know if paper works today, but that was their solution, and the FDA, US FDA, said it was okay. So we've written a paper, a white paper, both for US, APACMed has it, and then we just finished one for MedTech Europe that has these solutions on it. So the FDA has accepted it. The European Commission, they have modified their guidance on systems and procedure packs to basically say that the language was just put in last month, and I can't think of it verbatim, but basically there is an exception for the UDI to be on the package, and the exception applies to these non-sterile orthopedic non-sterile implant sets. We can get the reference of that paper for you if that helps.
Yeah, certainly. I think thank you very much, Jackie, for that information. Yeah, so that reference or any other information which might help us to pursue our strategy with Indian regulators. And even if you could have any additional information apart from US and Europe, is there any other developed market like Canada, Japan? If they are also working to grant an exemption, that might help us to make our case much more stronger in India when we pursue our advocacy.
Okay, so far it's only been US and Europe, but we really haven't gotten into that level of detail with the others. But we'll actually, we've been talking about it with South Korea at a very high level. But yeah, I'll pull some of that stuff out and I'll have Tania send it.
Sure, sounds good. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So thanks. I'm conscious of time. We have the last half an hour left. So, so Jackie and Tania, how do you want to structure the next half an hour? Shall we take a couple of more questions now, or do you feel we should move ahead and then maybe, pause for some time for more questions?
Yeah, so let's move ahead and maybe try to finish up the slides. I think we just have a handful more, and then we can go back to the questions.
Sure. So please carry on. Thank you.
Yeah, so the next part, we're going to talk about the UDI and the package hierarchy. So again, a trade item hierarchy level is assigned a GTIN when there is a need to retrieve, information, as it may be priced or ordered or invoiced at any point within the supply chain. So again, the primary package, level is going to be the innermost layer of the packaging, and it's going to be the layer that's closest to the product. So in the example that you can see on the left, that's going to be the single unit package. And so then the secondary package is going to be the layer of packaging that surrounds the primary. And, this may be used for purpose of, presentation or branding. But again, it may contain one or more of the primary packages. So in this example, you can see that we have a single needle that's going to be in the primary package. And then we put 4 needles inside of a box. So now the box is going to be the secondary package. And then there's going to then be the tertiary package, which is going to be the layer of packaging that contains multiple secondary. So you can see in this case that represents the case. So the case actually has 3 packs of the needles, and then the package only has 1 needle. So overall in the case, there's going to be 12 needles, but they are going to be, different packaging hierarchies. And there will be a GTIN kind of assigned for each of the different levels. So we talk about the higher level of GTINs. Again, there's going to be a GTIN assigned at each level. So as we go, the higher levels of packaging are going to be assigned a separate unique GTIN, even if these levels are considered to be trade items. So as we were talking about before, if you were to change, instead of having, 4 needles in a box, you want to have 2 needles. And you can see that's going to be represented by GTIN-B. If we were to change the number of needles in the box, the GTIN is going to have to change. So there'll probably be a GTIN-B, and then probably maybe a GTIN-D that will represent the 2-pack within that. So again, the hierarchical, so the hierarchy levels, they're going to be, down to that single unit of use. It may have a GTIN assigned, but it may not be marked on that level. So even though that you see the single unit package has GTIN-A, that may or may not actually have that on the label itself. So the significance of a global UDI approach to UDI, I think, Jackie spoke at this at a high level in the beginning of this, but again, it provides a more efficient and accurate automated capture of device information along the supply chain to the patient. It definitely provides a global visibility to the device adverse events and for recall devices, and it makes a better means to perform post-market surveillance globally. So this is why it's important that we don't want to have GTINs per region, because we would not be able to link, the information for even though it's the same product, if we're identifying it differently, we won't be able to link all that data together. It definitely simplifies the international vigilance and quality defects reporting for incidents affecting more than one legislative jurisdiction. So again, it gives us the ability of seeing and understanding things at a global level with our products. It allows the healthcare providers to, auto capture this device information consistently and accurately in their electronic healthcare records. As we mentioned before, the providers have to make sure that their systems are able to take in the multiple information. As we mentioned before, if they have their system where it's set up where for every catalog number, it only allows you to have 1 GTIN, this is not going to be, a big benefit. But the healthcare providers can make sure their systems are able to retrieve all the information. It would be very powerful. Again, it captures, accurate and consistent device information within the different device registries globally. It enhances the traceability, throughout the global supply chain. So it definitely makes it, a lot easier for recalls and device shortages. The example Jackie showed you guys in the very beginning, where we had the 3, and the 3 different the 3 different products, but they were kind of all identified the same. But the same, and then as they change along the supply chain, if we had to go back and want to recall back that 30965, it's changed throughout the supply chain, so it makes it really challenging to do a recall. But with UDI, it definitely kind of helps that out. It also promotes the transparency of data sharing and collaboration amongst regulators and between industry and regulators, and it also improves product security for products supplied in different legislative jurisdictions. Jackie's been involved with UDI for 15 years, or probably 20 plus years, Jackie. Maybe I don't want to say that. But again, I've been involved with UDI since 2013, and I'm amazed at how it's evolved in the 7 years. Because when I came on board, I really focused on the U.S. So some of the big things that have evolved that I've been seeing as we've been getting new, regulations have been, the data compliance and, making sure that we're making things, efficient and receiving the benefits. From a data side, the big thing is how do we keep, some of this data harmonized? And that's, when Jackie mentioned about the IMDF guidelines, trying to have these core data and make sure that each of these, attributes, mean the same thing. So we don't want something to change between different regulations. I have seen, kind of this particular issue that we have, this concept of primary DI. And so it's labeled as primary DI from a US, and they also have that same identifier or that same attribute for China, but it means two different things. So with the US, the primary DI means what's the lowest level that's labeled, whereas in China, it's going to be what's the lowest level that's sellable. And as we just saw that stuff about, the different hierarchies, makes it, challenging, as we want to try and send this data, to these global systems. If primary DI means something different for each region, how do we do that internally to keep that separate? So we want to make sure that, we kind of, adopt as many standards as we can from a data perspective and make sure that we improve the, how we collect and store our data and integrate these core data concepts. Because another challenge is that, we could get, I'll give you another example, is going to be MRI safety. With the US, it means the same thing in South Korea as well as the US. The list of values that the US system allows is 4, whereas China or South Korea actually allows you to have 5. And so how do you start to implement that 5th value? Because the 5th value cannot be used for the US submissions, but it's something that's required for China. So it's almost like we have some type of duplication data just because we have to make sure that we send the right data to the right global database. Compliance is actually getting to be a little bit more challenging. When I first started back in 2013, we were just focused on the US. They did have a multi-year implementation plan, which is, really beneficial for manufacturers, especially if you have, tons and tons of product that need to be, be prepared and ready and compliant for the different regions. But now back in 2013, we just focused on the US. And so now we're in 2020 where we're trying to juggle what needs to be done for South Korea, for China, for Saudi Arabia, and the EU all at the same time. So that's definitely going to be a challenge. So, we're trying to, make sure and figure out how are we going to, refine our process as we have to implement the new countries. How can we, extend our submission capabilities? How data goes over to, South Korea from a machine-to-machine capability is very different as far as how we're going to do it from a US, and we're seeing it's going to have to be different from as well. So we want to make sure that we're there's still, a challenge that we have is how are we going to expand our current system to meet the expectations for all these global databases. And then, of course, we have to constantly extend our team structure to make sure that we can support the geographies and take in, the new requirements as well. So for efficiency and benefits, again, there's definitely opportunities for us to optimize our business process and supply chain efficiencies, and the opportunity to provide the best data for our customers. So again, we're still all constantly looking at different case studies, seeing looking at the future state to figure out what we've done in the past, is that going to be able to continue to be used in the future. So, in closing, we can say that no one can solve the world's healthcare challenges alone. And kind of one of our taglines with Medtronic is that let's take, healthcare further together. So I hope I've left time for questions. I felt there still were tons, and I can go back to if you guys have identified the slide that you want to review, we can do that.
Yeah, thanks, Tania. I think there are some questions on the chat window, so maybe I'll read out those first. So we have one from Ashok. He's asking if DPM is one of the methods of orthopaedic implant.
If BPM is I didn't hear the last.
Is DPM one of the methods for orthopedic implants?
Jackie, I'm not sure I know the answer to that one.
Yes, it can be. It's not mandated. We do not have to direct mark any implants in any region. It has not been mandated for implants. That is a method that is acceptable to DPM direct part mark, for those of you who are wondering what that means.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. You're right. Actually, I mean, even when you look at the US implementation phase also, I mean, for DPM, the last phase is the phase for DPM. Like it was, the timeline was given up to, I think it was up to 2020 or something like that.
Yeah, the timelines for direct marking are 2 years beyond the labeling requirement for each classification. Yep.
That's right.
Correct.
Thank you for clarifying that, Jackie. I wasn't quite sure what DPM was. I thought I heard BPM, which is kind of our workflow process, but thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Okay. We have another question from Tanushri from Cardinal Health. She's asking, since we talked about the point of use, will hospitals, clinics be also mandated or trained across to capture the UDI numbers in their database? Do we have guidance coming out for hospitals and clinics in developed countries?
We do. We have had guidance in the US, but in the US, FDA does not have jurisdiction over the hospitals, so they cannot mandate. They do have a regulation that sort of ties Medicare reimbursement to certain, I think it's class 3 devices. So they've tried to enforce use of UDI in that manner, but the truth is, in the US, they don't have jurisdiction to mandate that over the hospitals. But they have done training, user guides, and we really look to the issuing entities. So we look to GS1, we look to HIBIC to be the ones to train those hospitals on how to use their standards, because at the end of the day, these are the issuing entities. It's their standard that's being used in the hospital, and they should be in their, it's something we talk about within GS1 is how are we going to get more of the GS1 member organizations to train these hospitals on how they can scan and capture their identifiers, because it's more than just a scanner. You need a system that will, after you scan that, you have to capture it in a system, and then that system has to provide that data to another system. It's a requires systems integration and work, and we're hoping that the issuing entities spend some time doing that. In Europe, the European Commission has developed FAQs for the hospitals. And again, as industry, we have talked to the Commission and have reminded them that it's really important that they get to the hospitals and those hospital organizations to make sure they understand how to scan, capture, and have the systems in place to scan, capture. What we learned in the US is a lot of the hospitals are just not prepared. And trying to get them there, it's been tough, but they're starting. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Tanushri. I hope that has answered your question, so that we can move on to the next. I have a question from Tran Quan, who asks, does UDI apply to personalized medical device?
Personalized, do you mean custom? devices, or when you say personalized, I'm not exactly sure
So,
how that's
Tran,
defined.
Hi. Hi, thank
if you're
you.
there,
Thank you for the presentation and the sharing. Yeah, so personalized is not exactly customized, but yes, we can think about it that is individualized to the patient. So in this kind of situation, first, do we think that there is a UDI requirement, and also whether this will value add to that as well?
Mhm. So what we've seen so far in the US and in Europe, and I think in Saudi Arabia, Tania, correct me if I'm wrong, is that UDI applies to all medical devices. There are a couple exceptions. Custom devices and clinical was in the US exempt. But it really applies to all medical devices. What I think you might be, there is an exception for those devices that are reusable, but only for one patient. They're not reusable between patients. For instance, a diabetes pump. The patient has one pump, it's reusable, but only one patient uses that pump. There is a rule that says any, in the US and in Europe, anything that's reusable has to have the UDI directly marked on the device. There is an exception for that direct marking if the device is not used between patients. If it's only one single patient using it, it was that part of your, I'm not sure that was part of your question, but when you talk about personalized devices, that's where I kind of go on that requirement. But I haven't seen any, are there any direct marking requirements in India so far? Has that been a discussion?
Maybe
no,
I can.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Tran.
I'll speak to my product. Actually, hi everyone. So we are in the aligner business. So this is individualized to each patient. So I believe that in India at this moment, we are not considered as a medical device, and so I will not be able to answer that. But Ashok, maybe you have some further insights for India.
Yeah, in India, actually, the requirement for UDI will kickstart only as per rule from 28 January onwards. But we are still having discussions on that. But once we have discussion with the regulator, we may think about this thing like direct part marking. If I mean, that is something, the call which the orthopedic implant manufacturers will have to take on that. But I agree with your this thing that maybe an RFID for products like screws and all, where there is a traceability loss when it is again. I mean, when it is sent on loaner kits, we have an issue on traceability, and therefore it's a good thing that if we can have something on that, that will help if a global system is there, because technically our regulators have not really understood the impact of the traceability loss in the orthopedic industry. So when it comes to light, definitely they can move in and ask for unreasonable things. So if we can have some solution to that, that will be helpful. Maybe the industry, the orthopedic industry colleague Shiv, you can take the lead on that.
Yeah, it is a very important point to bring up ahead early in the process. And I will send those documents and to be distributed, just so you have an idea of, the types of exceptions that we've received in US, in EU, and to use that with the authorities as a basis for maybe what happens in India. But it is key. You're correct. It is key that we do maintain that traceability with those devices, and we just need to focus on developing those solutions on how to do that. And the regulators are very open in the U.S. and in Europe on accepting multiple solutions because they recognize it's important that we are able to continue to distribute those orthopedic sets non-sterile because the clinicians, they really need the sets to come in those configurations. We had a situation in Europe where there was an interpretation that we couldn't do non-sterile loaner orthopedic sets anymore. And some manufacturers started sterilizing all their little tiny screws, and the surgeons in Germany had a fit. They said, this is not acceptable. We have to have access to these devices in these non-sterile sets. We can't have all of these little tiny packages all over the place and taking screws out and a lot of package waste. And so I think the healthcare community has a voice as well.
Yeah, that's right, Jackie. But the thing is, I mean, in the regulator's perspective, if there is a traceability loss on an implant which goes, it's going to create big ripples in the regulator side. And of course, there are some regulators who are aware of that, but most of the regulators are not aware of what's happening on the ground, and therefore, I mean, but over a period of time, this can it can become aware, and this can create an issue. So it's better that we develop and take it in the first discussion itself. Otherwise, it can throw up unreasonable demands from the regulators.
Yep, I absolutely agree.
Okay, so we have a few people who have who've raised their hands, so maybe we can give them a chance first. Screen name R. Hatekar. Are you there? Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you. This is Rajan Hatekar from Johnson & Johnson. I have two questions. The first one is very basic one, which in the beginning of the presentation, there were two terms that were mentioned, traceability and track and trace. I would like to understand the difference between these two and the implications that we would have in these two terms. That is one. And the second question is about the three levels of packaging that we saw on another slide. And is the barcode requirement is same across all these three levels? That means, does all the three levels need the GTIN, the batch number, as well as the expiry date on the barcode on all these three levels?
Jackie, do you want to take the first part, the track and traceability?
Sure. So the difference between traceability and track and trace fundamentally is traceability is tracing from the manufacturer through the supply chain to the consignee or to the patient. And it provides that tracing with, it could be a serial number, it could be a lot number. What track and trace is being able to track every movement from manufacturing through distribution, through the supply chain to the patient. It actually tracks every single movement of that product. And to do that, the product has to have a unique serial number. You need real-time systems to let you know that product A Okay, came out of manufacturing, went into distribution, came out of distribution and went to this distributor, went from that distributor at this point to this hospital, to this place in the hospital, to this patient by serial number. You can't do track and trace effectively with lot numbers because the duplicate numbers. And so traceability is what we've done for years and we do every day. It's pretty basic, simple systems and following the supply chain, but track and trace is very, very unique in that you have to have this serial number, so you can't have a duplicate product entering the supply chain with that same number. And that's how they stop counterfeiting. Any product coming in the supply chain has to be tracked at every single point of movement. And that every single point of movement has to be reported back to a central system to make sure it's being accounted for and that it's not a duplicate. And so that takes some pretty powerful systems and real-time tracking. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
Yeah, that does answer the question. So what I understand is then the traceability is requires a lot number on the product, while the track and trace requires a serial number for each of the unique medical device.
Correct. And the way they do it in pharma today is actually they start with a lot number and then they have both. It starts with a lot number and then it goes down to a serial number. So they can aggregate, they use the lot number to aggregate a lot of serial numbers, if that makes sense. So you might see both if you're doing track and trace, but it has to have a serial number to do it effectively.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. We have about 5 minutes left, and we still have a few hands raised. So can you quickly move on to Ed? Ed Wu. Ed, if you're there, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Else, I'll move on to Yatin Shah.
Hi. Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes. Hello.
Okay. Now I think we have both of you. So maybe Ed, maybe you can start with your question first.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. My question I already texted. Basically, is there an issue with when we submit to get product license in some markets, where we bundle the machine with accessories like applicators and catheters, like for ablation machine? And would UDI cause problems in these kind of situations, especially if the local UDI regulation requires like the license number into their database? And how to address this problem in the sense that, I mean, what the industry should be advocating to these regulators on that issue? I'll mute and listen.
Okay. Tania, do you want me to?
Yeah, I still have enough.
I want to take this because I just want to say hi, Ed. Haven't talked to you in a long time. Ed and I are colleagues from way back. So Ed, when this bundling, I'm thinking in terms of procedure packs or systems. And the legislation we've seen so far tells us that you assign the UDI to the devices only. And the UDI gets assigned at the system or procedure pack level. And that represents everything in that system or procedure pack, but only the entire procedure pack or system gets the UDI. So that would be how you would tie that to your license number, is for the entire system.
Right, but
That's
Jackie,
what we've seen so far.
yeah, but Jackie, isn't there also, so if we were trying to see if I could see it, that if they are selling the catheters separately outside the system, that would be a separate submission to UDI, because it probably would have a different product registration if they're selling the catheters, the applicators separately, but you wouldn't see that link in the UDI of the system, and connected to the catheter GTINS as well, if they're sold separately.
Yeah, and that's true for legislation. Anything that is classified as a medical device that you're placing on the market individually has to have its own UDI. So
Okay.
that's how we would capture that.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. But I think then in the sense that, well, I can understand that, especially like when you have a recall on only certain accessory or catheter that is individually sold, then with a bundle license that would cause a problem. But I mean, what your answers are basically, then we can no longer bundle systems in licenses.
Jackie, this is Sumati. I just have a clarification in, taking it forward from what Edward is saying. So let's take an example of guide wires. So guide wires, usually come like in 6 in pack, etc. But then they would have on its pack the UDI. Now the pack may be opened and supplied individually, right? So in that case, the UDI would be on the individual pack of the guide wire as well, and it should align. Is my understanding correct?
Yeah. Align, it cannot be the same identifier. It has to be different. So with what we're looking at right now, the each has to have its own identifier. The pack of 5 has a separate identifier. And then the case has a different identifier, because that device identifier, or GTIN, identifies the quantity within that package. So each time you change the quantity, you have to change the identifier. So you can't have each cannot have the same UDI as the 5-pack, because the GTIN for the each represents a single unit. The GTIN for the pack represents 5 units. So that's how we make those determinations, is each package hierarchy has to have its own identifier. Does that make sense?
Yes, but then that means the system would have 2 different UDIs for the same product, right?
Well, if it's approved as a system, you may have multiple identifiers within the system, but so far the legislation we've seen has told us you need an identifier for the entire system, and then your device records would tell you what's in that system.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yep. We haven't had to so far identify a system and all of the contents in a system. That hasn't.
So is there a, to a certain degree, even in the US, there's an industry working on trying to work with a regulator to try to address this kind of, otherwise, we all have to split up all the system into, the accessories, and even just now the question is if we have, one pack versus individual pack versus 5-pack, then every single kind of sellable unit, where the single pack or multi-pack will have a different license.
Right. Well, it will have a different identifier.
Right, right.
But it probably be all covered under the same license. I think the way that it goes into this, I mean, this I think is a conflict, Jackie. I think in South Korea that they're having to individually put in, like, this is the case GTIN and this is the package GTIN. But from like a UDI perspective, we kind of put in what's called the primary DI, and then we have it associated to all the different packaging levels because they're going to be used differently. So the case would be the GTIN that probably, gets the big case to the hospital. But once it gets to the hospital, they have, 4 packages inside that case. So they're going to take it out the case, and then the hospital has to put the cases probably to scan it from an inventory perspective. And then once they take the case out and want to start using it individually, they're going to want to scan. Yep.
But we have to remember what we said earlier about the assumption that it's not a one-to-one relationship. It's not one license per one GTIN, because a single device may have several device identifiers associated with it. So you never want to get in that situation where you have one license and one device identifier.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this regulation allows for that as well. I mean, not that one-to-one, allow one license to multiple UDI?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, in Europe, it's why they created this concept of a basic UDI device identifier. And it's a grouping mechanism because they understood that a single device can have multiple device identifiers. And the reasons for that is different quantities trigger different numbers because each level has to be identified separately, or maybe something changed on your label, your languages or your market. Well, that requires you to change your GTIN or your device identifier, same thing. But it's the same device. It's identical. You just changed something on your label that required you to get a new device identifier. So yes, Europe recognized that. Saudi Arabia has recognized it in their database. They give you a place where you can attach your initial GTIN. Say you changed something on your label and had to get a new GTIN, same product, and then you can put the new GTIN in and attach it to the old one. So Saudi Arabia recognizes that, and that's the way the GS1 standards work. That's the beauty of the standards. You can identify those differences without changing the primary identity of that device.
I think it's important that we keep the regulatory registration and licenses separated from UDI. I think that should be our advocacy that the regulators here in India, because otherwise it will complicate it to a great extent. I don't know, what's your recommendation?
It's a very good point, because you will end up in that place that, explaining that, okay, this one device can have many identifiers, so we cannot expect a one-to-one relationship between the license and the device identifier. It's a really good idea to make that clear up front. Maybe draw, I always like to draw visuals of that because it's not an easy concept to describe without a visual. And that would be my advice, is to have that conversation and either make sure it's separate, or if you end up in a place where it's absolutely required, then there has to be understanding that it cannot be a one-to-one relationship.
Yeah, is there a way to, whether IMDRF or industry or APACMed can put together some kind of as you say, visual or presentation that can help industry members to, provide, advocacy or training to regulators that this potential issue, and how regulators like in EU are understanding of or Saudi FDA is understanding this and address this in a effective manner.
It's a great idea, Ed.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
I'll help however I can, but yeah, nothing exists today. Sorry, but it's a really good idea, and the IMDRF UDI work group has been closed down, so that would be a great opportunity. I don't know what other avenues we have.
Well, maybe at least for Asia, we can try to do it. Since Saudi is involved with the HWP, or now it's GHWP, Asia Harmony, where they can share the experience in the sense that maybe one of the working group within the HWP can take this on. Working with APACMed or APACMed. So.
Yeah, I think, to start with, what we can recommend, we can, probably like the white papers, which Anirudh are looking at being drafted, and to be shared with Indian authorities. It would have an element of lessons learned worldwide, how UDI was implemented. So in that, one of the, recommendations can be that we need to separate this out, because this is what we have found, and then give an example of Saudi. Of course, capacity building would be taken up with the regulators. I don't know at what stage, but most important right now is in India that we have to have the guidance document to be drafted and rolled out, so that the timeline, which is almost like 1.5 years to 2 years time from now, could be met if they are really serious about implementing it from 2022. So I would say that let's phase it that way, and leave it to the group to decide.
Thanks, Sumati. And I know we have already overshot by 10 minutes, but Yatin has been patiently waiting, so I'll give him the last chance to ask one question before we wrap up.
Thank you, Anirudh, so much for giving me an opportunity to ask the question. And probably Sumati did touch upon this. My question was not only for the presenters, but also for all the industry experts who are on the call from India. And the question was, which Sumati did touch upon, are we still expecting clarification from our health authorities on UDI? If yes, what is that? Having so much of clarity on the UDI, industry experts knowing about the system pretty well, and with this presentation with all the clarity, what is that we want additional clarification or the direction from our health authorities, and by when it will be available?
Yeah, Yatin, I will touch upon that. Actually, right now in the regulation, they have just mentioned that the UDI should have a production identifier and a device identifier. That's all. And we need to have a clarity on what are all the requirements of the production identifier, because in certain economies like South Korea and all, they have country-specific requirements, and in our case also there is a probability that they may ask for a country-specific requirement. That is something which we need to shape with. We have a discussion with DCGI office and come to know about it. Then, as Sumati pointed out, there is a definite need for a guidance document. Then another thing is regarding the database management. Database management is one of the most important thing. Who will manage the database? Suppose if it is going to be the DCGI office, then that's okay. But suppose if its expectation is that the manufacturer has to maintain the database, whether it's allowed in India or whether it can be managed globally, sitting in this thing, because there are different manufacturers who do not have their offices in India. So definitely that also is another question which need to be answered. So, I mean, we are, the industry per se has been having discussion. We have raised this issue time and again with the regulator, and we are expecting feedback from the regulator, and we have to sit down and discuss on all these things. Then only a clarity will come out. Otherwise, that's why we are saying that, you know, like January 2022 has been put on this thing, but in our representation, we have requested that it will be, it need to be extended, or maybe the phased implementation can start from January 22. That's what we have been requesting.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. I know it's very late back in the US, so I think we need to now, I know there are many more questions, but we still do have another 2 more sessions that we have lined up on the 14th and the 21st, and hopefully we'll be able to get answers to those. So we can now end the session, and on behalf of this group, I think for Jackie and Tania, I think it was a very enriching session and a great start to our UDI series. So on behalf of the group and APACMed, please accept our sincere appreciation for agreeing to do this session and share your knowledge and expertise with the group. I think it was very informative, and looking at the number of participants we got, I think it illustrates the importance of this topic. So thank you once again, and we'll definitely be in touch in case we want any further clarification from you, probably on email. And also, it would be nice if you could share the latest version of the presentation and some of the papers that you had mentioned to me, which I could circulate it to the group who participated today.
Thanks, Anirudh, for the initiative, and thanks, Medtronic team, for giving a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Latika and Nishit. Yeah.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Tania. Bye.
Thanks, Jackie.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tania. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you,
Thanks,
Jackie.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
and bye.
Thank you, everyone.